In the 1870s, the centre of the deaf community in London was St Saviour's Deaf Church. Deaf members congregated there on Oxford Street and engaged in a thriving social life that involved debates and drama performances. They used sign language openly and with pride. We will be looking into the fascinating lives of 3 of these deaf people, offering us a glimpse into an extraordinary community in Victorian London. The Victorian era was the time of the Great British Empire, when Queen Victoria was on the throne. London was at the centre of this world. And for deaf people, St Saviour's Church was at the centre of the deaf community. We'll be exploring the lives of 3 deaf members of St Saviour's in the 1870s. One would become an artist, another a pioneer, and one a struggling printer who made a curious career change in order to survive. Charles Webb Moore was a deaf artist and wood engraver. He came from a large, multi-generational deaf family.
How are things at work? Oh, very busy.
And he was a deeply committed member of St Saviour's Deaf Church. Jane Elizabeth Groom was a teacher of the deaf, a Bible teacher and missionary working with deaf adults in one of the poorest parts of London. Skirving Thompson was an unemployed lithographic artist whose wife Amelia worked as an upholsteress. Through discovering each of their lives, we can understand what life was like for deaf people back then, including all their successes and failures. Will you go and find work?
No.
In 1873, St Saviour's opened its doors to the London deaf community. It was the first purpose-built church for deaf people in Britain. And it finally gave them a place to call their own. It was right here in the heart of the city, Oxford Street, then as now one of the busiest shopping streets in London. The church's role, and even exact location, is mostly forgotten, which is why I've come here today, to meet a historian who's been researching the history of St Saviour's Church. So Mike, there are some myths about where exactly St Saviour's was located, aren't there?
Yes, you're right. Some people believe that St Saviour's Church was pulled down to make way for Selfridges to be built on the same site, but this is not the case. In fact, the 2 buildings were neighbours and coexisted for a time on opposite sides of Oxford Street.
The church is now gone. Are there any remaining traces that can be seen today?
The church building was demolished, but visual evidence remains through various artwork and photographs. Look at this example. Although the church building no longer exists, we can still see the outline of where it stood by looking at a filled-in trench that remains on the pavement on the corner of Oxford Street. Welcome to St. Saviour's Church today.
So here we are in a typical Victorian church. Why was it that a deaf church was set up?
The 1840s was a time where deaf people faced many social issues, including poverty, alcoholism, and unemployment. A group of hearing people formed an association wanting to support the deaf community. They began to hold weekly church services in various rented venues, and in the end, the deaf community members told them that they wanted a place to call their own.
So was St. Saviour's Church designed specifically with deaf people in mind?
From the outside, no, it just looked the same as any other church. However, it was in the interior that you could see strong visual elements linked to deaf people. At a service for deaf people, there would be no need for a choir or an organ, so these elements were removed. Sight lines were the most important thing, so there were no pillars blocking people's view, and the seating was raked so that all could see clearly. Every year there would be a service open to the wider public, with one preacher speaking and leading the service from one pulpit and another preacher signing the service from the other pulpit, so here deaf and hearing people could worship equally.
But was the church really for the deaf community?
Absolutely, yes, for all deaf people, no matter if you were poor, rich, employed, an artist or an engineer. This church was for all the diverse members of the deaf community.
Charles Webb Moore was a deaf artist and key member of the St. Saviour's deaf community.
That was a great service. Thank you. How have you been? Very well, I'm doing a lot of engraving work. Oh, I'm pleased to hear it.
Some examples of his drawings and engravings can be seen here in various books. And I'm also here to meet someone who can tell us about Charles Webb Moore. Charles Webb Moore painted several portraits of key deaf members of St. Saviour's, and this is one of them. Yes, this is Thomas Davidson. He was an artist too. He, along with Charles, was one of the many deaf members at St. Saviour's. Many people believe that St. Saviour's was just a church, but actually the deaf community would gather there socially. Indeed, Charles Webb Moore, Thomas Davidson and others would write and perform plays where large audiences of deaf people would watch and enjoy seeing sign language performed. Charles Webb Moore was also one of the leaders and participants of the Deaf Debating Society. One topic, debated in front of a large audience, was King Charles I justly put to death? So was Charles Webb Moore a member of a deaf family? Yes, he was the second of 6 generations. 6? That's a lot. His parents were both deaf, and indeed his father was an artist too. then Charles, and now there is Jennifer and her daughter Gemma as the 5th and 6th generations. Jennifer is a teacher at Oak Lodge Deaf School in London, and her daughter Gemma is currently at university studying to become a teacher of the deaf. Oh, I'd like to meet them to talk about their family history. Charles Webb Moore died in 1933 and is buried here in Willesden, West London, alongside his deaf wife Emily and his daughter Maud. But 4 generations of his family have come after him, all deaf. How are you related to Charles Webb Moore? Charles Webb Moore was my great-grandfather. This is my mum, so that makes him my great-great-grandfather. He had deaf parents as well, and so I represent the 6th deaf generation of the family. So what do you know about Charles Webb Moore? He was a famous and well-known artist in the deaf community who did a lot of paintings and portraits. Also, he did a lot of engravings. Here, I'll show you an example of his work. Charles Webb Moore painted a miniature of his grandson. This boy is my father, Gerald Moore. The likeness is amazing. It's one of my most treasured possessions. What do you know about Charles Webb Moore's involvement with St Saviour's Church? We are both involved in deaf education and in the deaf community, but we don't know much about that. At St Saviour's, he produced many plays with his brother-in-law, Skirving Thompson, who was married to Amelia, his sister. They often performed on stage for large deaf audiences. Your family was strongly involved with St Saviour's, and they received a lot of support from the church. Skirving Thompson struggled to find a job, so he resorted to obtaining funds by deception. When Amelia Thompson died, St Saviour's cared for her children, and they placed them at a school. The family of Skirving Thompson and Charles Webb Moore both gave and received support from St Saviour's. Wow! That's a lot of information that we didn't know. We should be researching this ourselves. I feel the same. Right, now we're going to find out more. Jane Groom was a pupil and later teacher of the deaf at Manchester Deaf Institution. In 1876, she moved to London to teach deaf children at Reverend William Stainer's school. She was forced to leave her job when the Reverend Stainer changed the education system at his school to the new oralist philosophy. Jane Groom began teaching a Bible class to deaf adults at Morley Hall in Hackney. She also carried out mission work providing support to deaf women and girls in the poorest areas of London. How are you, Amelia? I'm very poorly. Have you found work yet?
No, nothing.
Jane Groom was compassionate, but she was also a very determined, single-minded woman. She was deeply concerned about the lack of employment opportunities for deaf people and how several of them were living in poverty and in poor health. She wondered how to find a solution to this issue. While on holiday in Canada in 1883, she saw that there were plenty of land and work opportunities there, and so she decided to set up an immigration scheme for deaf people to move for a new life in Canada. To raise funds for her Canadian emigration scheme, Jane Groom organised drama performances featuring deaf actors, and she also published a pamphlet outlining her plan. She found support from several notable people, including Henry Fawcett, the blind MP and campaigner, and the Prime Minister at the time, William Gladstone. In the summer of 1884, Jane Groom travelled to Canada with the first group of young deaf men. The group had a variety of skills. One was a printer, one a painter and decorator, and one a compositor. A second group followed on in 1885, including deaf men and their families, set to build their own deaf community in Winnipeg, in the Canadian Midwest. But there were many questions to be answered about the scheme. Would they have the skills to become self-sufficient? Did Jane Groom have the necessary leadership skills? And how would the locals react to the new deaf community arrivals? So what was life like for the first group of deaf men in Canada? One of the men, Francis George Jefferson, a printer from Manchester, wrote a long letter about their new experiences in Canada, which was printed in a local newspaper in Manchester.
Most of us got employed on farms. I can advise the mutes to come if they are willing to work hard. But they must have strong hearts to bear the summer's hot sun and also the very cold times in winter. I have every confidence of the mutes prospering with God's blessing.
Jane Groom's emigration scheme got off to a good start, but there were soon challenges to face, including opposition to the scheme from a number of directions. I'm here at the London Metropolitan Archives to find out more about this scheme, with the help of some interesting documents, and to meet historian Esme Cleal.
So what happened to the deaf people who were involved in Jane Groom's emigration scheme when they arrived in Canada?
Well, we know a lot of them found it very difficult. These were people from London, they were urban dwellers, and they didn't have the skills that they needed to be in the agricultural plains of Canada. So they did find it difficult to make ends meet, particularly in the long, harsh winters. But we know that sign language started to be used by some of the local farmers, the hearing farmers, and so this is a good sign that the deaf settlers were respected in that community. But others did find it too difficult, particularly those who were unskilled and ended up coming back to London penniless.
We can see from St Saviour's minutes that they mention 2 deaf men who gave up everything, sold their furniture and all their worldly goods to go to Canada. When it didn't work out, they returned to London and again asked St Saviour for support, money to buy furniture. St Saviour seemed very reluctant to do that, and they said that Jane Groom should be supporting them. So it seems, although there were supporters of the scheme, there was opposition too. Who were they?
Well, there were 2 groups of critics. One was in Canada, where there was opposition to deaf and disabled people migrating to Canada generally. And there was a lot of prejudice about disabled people being, quote, undesirable immigrants and not the kind of people that they wanted to build their society with. So there was opposition in the newspapers there. But what's more surprising perhaps is that there was also some opposition within the East London community and even within St Saviour's itself.
And we can also see that mentioned in the minutes as well. St Saviour's had some discussions with the Charitable Organisation Society, which looked into people, and they felt that Jane Groom wasn't a suitable person to manage this scheme. It also seems that they were willing to pay money for an advert to be placed in the Times newspaper to discourage people to be supporting this scheme. Why do you think Jane Groom faced such opposition?
Well, there seemed to be some personal levels of disagreement with Jane Groom, and the RADD felt that it was a bit beyond their remit. But really, I think we can think of some of the causes as being that she was deaf and that she was a woman. This was an organisation mainly run by hearing people, for deaf people, and I don't think they liked the independence that Jane Groom faced. But to some extent, we've got to remember that this would be a fate that all women faced in the 19th century, which is, of course, a very patriarchal society.
It seems Jane Groom's scheme was only a partial success. Undaunted, she continued to work in the London deaf community, particularly with deaf women. When the British Deaf and Dumb Association was founded in 1890, she was a participant at the first gathering in Leeds. Jane Groom died in 1918 at the age of 76, having led an independent life, much dedicated to her work, undeterred by others who tried to stop her progress.
Our Father, who art in heaven.
Skirving Thompson was born to deaf parents in Edinburgh, and he was one of the first deaf pupils to enter Donaldson's Hospital when it opened in 1851. After completing an apprenticeship in the printing trade, he moved to London in 1867 and became a member of St Saviour's Deaf Church, where he met and married Amelia Moore. Amelia was Charles Webb Moore's sister. She had been educated at the London Asylum in the Old Kent Road and was an upholsteress at Heel's furniture shop. Skirving Thompson struggled to support Amelia and their 3 children because he was often out of work. He appealed to St Saviour's for financial aid, and although it was given, it wasn't enough. So he turned to a career of deception. Skirving looked in newspapers for notices containing names of people who had donated money to charities. Some of the donations were given anonymously. He then wrote to those charities asking for the return of his anonymous donation, which, he said, was given in error. Skirving's scam was soon exposed. He was arrested and tried at the Old Bailey in 1879. One of the chief prosecution witnesses was the Prime Minister's wife, Catherine Gladstone, who had received his letter and was tricked into sending him back his donation of 5 guineas. Skirving Thompson was sentenced to 12 months hard labour in prison. His wife Amelia, meanwhile, was near death with cancer.
Do you believe in Jesus?
Yes.
Then don't worry. If we meet no more on earth, we shall meet again in heaven.
She died soon after, leaving behind 3 young children with no one to care for them.
What about my children? Don't worry. We at St. Saviour's will take care of them.
Skirving Thompson was in and out of court and prison around the country for the rest of his life. From the 1901 census, he's a patient in the infirmary at a workhouse in Liverpool. It's assumed he died shortly after and was given a pauper's grave. Charles Webb Moore, Jane Groom and Skirving Thompson all led distinctive, well-documented lives, and St. Saviour's was always central to their experiences. The cliché idea of deaf people of the past is that they lacked opportunity, were meek, submissive, disempowered, and just followed a path prescribed by the missioner. As we've seen, this is a myth, since deaf people were strong and confident characters and led colourful, eventful lives. Once you open the book of deaf history, there are many more stories waiting to be told.
Thank you.